August 29th, 1944. Somewhere along the coastal road between Saint-Lô and Chartres, France, Hauptmann Friedrich Müller of the Wehrmacht's 116th Panzer Division crouched in a roadside ditch, his field glasses trained on the horizon. The late summer heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt, distorting the scene before him into something that seemed impossible, almost hallucinatory. Trucks, endless trucks. They stretched from horizon to horizon, a river of olive-drab metal flowing eastward without pause. Not just dozens, not even hundreds, thousands of them, each bearing a distinctive red circle painted on their canvas sides and wooden tailgates. American 2½-ton cargo trucks, moving in an unbroken procession that had been passing his position for nearly 6 hours. Müller had been a logistics officer before his transfer to combat command. He understood supply chains, transportation capacity, industrial production. What he was witnessing defied everything he had learned about the limitations of motorized warfare. The German army moved supplies with horses, supplemented by whatever trucks could be scraped together, and kept running through constant mechanical breakdowns. This American convoy represented more functioning trucks in a single afternoon than his entire division had possessed at full strength. He lowered the binoculars and looked at Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, his executive officer, who had joined him in the ditch. Hoffmann's face showed the same mixture of disbelief and growing dread that Müller felt churning in his gut. "How long have they been passing?" Hoffmann asked quietly. "Since 0900 hours, 6 hours without interruption." Müller's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man stating an uncomfortable fact. "I estimate we've seen approximately 2,000 vehicles so far. They're maintaining intervals of roughly 30 meters between trucks. Speed appears consistent at 40 to 50 kilometers per hour. Where are they all coming from? Where are they going?" "East," Müller replied simply. "Toward our positions, toward Germany." The implications settled over them like a physical weight. Müller thought about his own division's supply situation. They had perhaps 50 functioning trucks remaining from the 120 they had started the campaign with. Fuel was rationed so severely that vehicles often sat immobile, while horses dragged artillery pieces and supply wagons across the French countryside. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with 514,000 horses. Even now, in 1944, with Germany's vaunted industrial might supposedly at peak production, over 80% of German military transport still relied on animal power. These Americans moved everything by truck, and judging by what Müller was witnessing, they had trucks to spare. "We should report this to division headquarters," Hoffmann suggested. Müller nodded slowly. But what exactly would he report? That the Americans possessed more trucks than seemed physically possible? That their supply line functioned with mechanical precision that made German logistics look medieval by comparison? That the war Germany thought it was winning had already been lost in American factories? He raised the binoculars again. The trucks continued their relentless march eastward, carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, everything an army needed to sustain offensive operations. Each truck was loaded to capacity, sides bulging with cargo. The canvas tops stretched tight over payloads that probably exceeded the official 2½-ton rating these vehicles were designed to carry. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The trucks themselves were remarkably uniform. GMC CCKW 353 cargo trucks, though Müller didn't know the designation then. All painted in the same flat olive drab, all equipped with the same 6x6 wheel configuration, all moving with the same steady, reliable rhythm that spoke of mechanical soundness and adequate maintenance. This uniformity was itself significant. The German army used dozens of different truck types from various manufacturers, with spare parts that often weren't interchangeable. American standardization meant mechanics could repair any vehicle using parts from any other. It meant drivers trained on one truck could operate any truck in the fleet. It meant the entire system functioned as an integrated whole rather than a collection of incompatible pieces. Müller had heard the jokes. German soldiers laughed at American equipment, calling it crude, unsophisticated, built for quantity rather than quality. German engineers scoffed at American trucks with their simple designs and basic features. Where was the precision? Where was the technical excellence? American. Trucks lacked the refined engineering of German vehicles, or so the propaganda insisted. But those German trucks, with all their sophisticated engineering, were mostly broken, sitting in repair depots waiting for parts that never arrived, or abandoned beside roads when their complex transmissions failed or their engines seized. The Wehrmacht's logistics capacity had been steadily eroding since 1941, and by 1944 it had collapsed into barely controlled chaos. These American trucks, crude as they might be, were running, all of them, moving supplies without apparent difficulty, and there seemed to be an infinite supply of them. Hoffmann nudged Müller's shoulder and pointed. A truck had pulled to the side of the road about 200 meters away. The convoy continued flowing past without slowing. Within moments, 2 other trucks pulled over a maintenance vehicle and what appeared to be a recovery vehicle with a winch mounted on front. American soldiers in coveralls dismounted and began examining the disabled truck. Tools appeared. Parts were retrieved from the maintenance vehicle's storage compartments. The work proceeded with practiced efficiency, no wasted motion, everyone knowing their role in the repair procedure. 15 minutes later, the truck started. Smoke coughed from the exhaust, cleared, then settled into a steady idle. The recovery vehicles pulled back onto the road and merged into the convoy's flow. The repaired truck followed moments later, sliding smoothly into the endless line of vehicles. "Did you see that?" Hoffmann whispered. 15 minutes! From breakdown to operational, Müller had seen it. He had also seen German trucks sit beside roads for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for mechanics or parts or authorization to repair them. The American maintenance system operated with the same systematic efficiency as everything else about their military. He thought about the numbers. If approximately 2,000 trucks had passed his position in 6 hours, and this convoy had been operating since late August, he had heard reports of a massive American supply operation beginning around the 25th. Then tens of thousands of trucks might be involved in this single logistics operation, tens of thousands. Germany's entire motor vehicle production for all of 1943 had been perhaps 90,000 vehicles of all types. Civilian cars, military trucks, motorcycles, everything combined. And American factories had apparently produced so many trucks that they could dedicate thousands to a single supply route. The afternoon wore on. The trucks continued. Müller and Hoffmann remained in their observation position, compelled by a kind of horrified fascination to witness the full extent of American logistics capability. Around 1500 hours, the character of the convoy changed slightly. These trucks carried fuel cans, stacked and strapped in their cargo beds. Hundreds of jerry cans per truck, thousands of gallons of gasoline moving eastward to feed the American advance. Müller did rough calculations in his head. If each truck carried, conservatively, 5 tons of cargo and 2,000 trucks had passed, then 10,000 tons of supplies had moved past this single point in 6 hours, 10,000 tons. His entire division received perhaps 50 tons of supplies on a good day, and that was when the supply trains actually arrived. The Americans were apparently moving more supplies in one afternoon on one road than the Wehrmacht moved to an entire army group in a week. By 1700 hours, the convoy's composition changed again. These trucks carried ammunition, small arms rounds, artillery shells, mortar bombs. The deadly cargo was carefully secured, but the sheer volume was staggering. Germany rationed ammunition strictly. Soldiers were ordered to conserve rounds, to make every shot count, to avoid wasting scarce resources. These American trucks carried ammunition like it was cheap and abundant. Because, Müller realized with sinking certainty, for the Americans it was cheap and abundant. Hoffman broke the long silence. "We lost this war before it started, didn't we?" Müller didn't answer immediately. He thought about the confident predictions that had accompanied Germany's war plans. American industry was weak, soft, corrupted by capitalism and Jewish influence. American soldiers were untested, poorly trained, lacking the martial spirit that defined German fighting men. America's vast size and resources actually made it vulnerable, or so German intelligence had insisted, because such a sprawling nation could never organize itself effectively for total war. Every assumption had been catastrophically wrong. "We lost it," Müller finally said, "the moment we challenged a nation that could build trucks faster than we could destroy them. 18 months earlier, December 1942, Detroit, Michigan. The Willow Run bomber, plant stretched for more than a mile, the largest manufacturing building under a single roof anywhere in the world. But it wasn't the only American factory running at maximum capacity. Across the industrial heartland in Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Pontiac, St. Louis, automotive plants that had built civilian cars now built military trucks. The GMC Truck and Coach Division of Yellow Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, occupied a sprawling complex of brick buildings and concrete floors, where the CCKW design had finally been refined after several prototype iterations. The truck entered mass production in February 1941, and by late 1942, the assembly lines ran 24 hours daily in 3 shifts. The CCKW designation came from GMC's internal coding system, C for conventional cab configuration, K for all-wheel drive, W for tandem rear axles. The design year marker had been C for 1941 when full-scale production began. It would become, after the war, simply known as the Deuce and a half, a reference to its 2½-ton cargo capacity. Robert Harrison, the production manager, stood on a catwalk overlooking assembly line number 3. Below him, an incomplete truck chassis moved steadily along the conveyor system. Workers at precisely spaced stations added components with practiced efficiency: front axle assembly, transfer case, transmission, rear axle assemblies. Each worker performed the same tasks repeatedly, their motions refined through months of repetition until they could complete their assigned work in exactly the allotted time. Henry Ford had pioneered these assembly line techniques with the Model T automobile. GMC had adapted them for military truck production, and the results exceeded even optimistic projections. Where traditional manufacturing methods might produce 10 or 15 trucks daily with skilled craftsmen hand-fitting each component, the assembly line produced 50 trucks per shift, 150 trucks daily, over 45,000 trucks annually from this single facility. And Pontiac was just one of several GMC facilities building the CCKW. Harrison checked his clipboard, reviewing the morning production statistics. Shift 1 had completed 52 trucks between midnight and 800 hours. Quality control reported only 3 vehicles flagged for minor adjustments: a loose electrical connection, improperly torqued lug nuts, a dashboard gauge that needed recalibration. All 3 issues had been corrected within 30 minutes. The efficiency wasn't accidental. It resulted from systematic analysis of every aspect of the production process, identifying bottlenecks, optimizing workflow, standardizing components, and training workers to perform specific tasks with maximum effectiveness. American industrial engineers had been refining these techniques for 3 decades. When war came, the infrastructure was already in place. It just needed to be redirected from building civilian products to military equipment. The GMC 270 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine provided the CCKW's power, a simple, robust design rated at 91.5 horsepower, though actual output reached closer to 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute. Not particularly powerful by any absolute standard, but adequate for moving 5 tons of cargo over varied terrain at sustainable speeds. More importantly, The engine was reliable. It could run for months with minimal maintenance if properly serviced. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Any mechanic with basic training could diagnose and repair common problems. The design prioritized functionality over sophistication, durability over performance, ease of maintenance over technical excellence. German military trucks, by contrast, featured more advanced engineering, more powerful engines, more sophisticated transmissions, better power-to-weight ratios. They were genuinely superior vehicles in many technical respects. But they were also more complex, more expensive to build, harder to maintain, and prone to breakdown under harsh conditions. The German army entered the war with perhaps 15,000 military trucks. By 1944, attrition and inadequate replacement production had reduced that number catastrophically. America would eventually build over 560,000 CCKW trucks. Just the CCKW. Additional hundreds of thousands of other truck types from Dodge, International Harvester, Studebaker, and other manufacturers brought total American military truck production to over 2 million vehicles. The assembly line continued its steady progress. Harrison watched as the cab was lowered onto a chassis. The CCKW came in two cab variants, closed metal cabs and open cabs with canvas roofs and removable doors. The open cab version saved material and shipping space, though it offered less protection for drivers. About 25% of trucks were equipped with a ring mount above the passenger seat for a 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun. Each truck took approximately 4 hours to complete, from bare chassis to fully assembled vehicle. That time included quality control inspections at multiple stages. Engines were tested, transmissions were checked, brakes were adjusted, electrical systems were verified. Every truck received a final road test before acceptance. 4 hours, 96 trucks daily per assembly line. 3 assembly lines per factory, multiple factories. Harrison had visited Germany before the war, touring automotive plants as part of an industrial exchange program. He had been impressed by German precision and attention to detail. German engineers built beautiful machines with excellent specifications, but they built them slowly, in relatively small quantities, using methods that required highly skilled craftsmen performing intricate handwork. America built trucks that were good enough, in quantities that were overwhelming. That was the fundamental difference. German industry optimized for quality. American industry optimized for volume. When the two systems competed, volume won. The war in Europe had begun in September 1939. America hadn't entered until December 1941. During those 27 months, while Germany conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Norway, Denmark, and drove deep into the Soviet Union, American factories had been tooling up for war production. By the time American forces joined the fighting, the industrial infrastructure was already in place and expanding rapidly. Germany could never catch up. The industrial capacity didn't exist. The raw materials weren't available. The fuel was strictly rationed. The skilled workforce had been drafted into military service. German truck production in 1943 reached perhaps 60,000 vehicles. America produced 30 times that number. Harrison moved along the catwalk to observe the final assembly area. Completed trucks sat in neat rows, awaiting delivery to army depots. Each truck was identical to every other truck of the same variant. Same paint scheme, same equipment loadout, same specifications. When these trucks reached military units, mechanics could service them using the same tools and procedures. Drivers could operate them without additional training. Supply sergeants could order parts using standardized catalog numbers. This standardization extended throughout American military production. Jeeps from Willys and Ford were interchangeable. Rifles from different manufacturers used identical parts. Ammunition from various factories was interchangeable. The entire American military machine was designed as an integrated system, where every component worked with every other component. German military production, by contrast, suffered from lack of standardization. Dozens of different truck types from various manufacturers. multiple incompatible rifle designs, artillery pieces that used different ammunition types, tank designs that were constantly modified mid-production. The result was a logistics nightmare where parts couldn't be shared, procedures had to be customized for each equipment type, and the supply chain became progressively more fragmented and inefficient. A worker on the assembly line raised his hand, signaling for Harrison's attention. Harrison descended from the catwalk and walked over. The worker, an older man named Frank Peterson, who had worked for GMC since 1928, pointed to a fuel line connection that wasn't seating properly. "Connector doesn't match the specification," Peterson explained. "Wrong thread pitch. Should be 7/16 20. This one's 3/8 24. Harrison examined the connection, verified the discrepancy, and made a note on his clipboard. "Hold this unit. I'll contact quality control and have them check the connector batch. Good catch, Frank." This was how the system worked. Workers with decades of experience knew when something wasn't right, even if it passed cursory inspection. They had the authority to stop the line and flag problems. Management responded quickly because keeping production moving smoothly was more important than any individual ego. The entire organization was aligned toward the single goal of building functional trucks as efficiently as possible. Harrison returned to his office and made several phone calls. Within 20 minutes, quality control had traced the incorrect connectors to a supplier batch that had been mislabeled. The affected connectors were quarantined. Correct replacements were delivered to the assembly line. Production resumed with minimal delay. By end of shift, Assembly Line 3 had produced 49 trucks instead of the planned 52. The 3-unit shortfall was noted, analyzed, and adjusted for in the next days and production schedule. No one was blamed. The problem was treated as a process issue to be identified and corrected, not a personnel failure requiring punishment. This approach, systematic problem-solving without blame, enabled continuous improvement. Workers flagged issues without fear of repercussion. Management responded with solutions rather than criticism. The result was steadily increasing efficiency and quality. German military production took a different approach. Problems were often concealed to avoid punishment. Managers blamed workers. Workers blamed materials. Everyone blamed everyone else. Production quotas were met on paper, while actual quality deteriorated. The system optimized for appearing successful rather than actually functioning effectively. Harrison stayed late that evening, reviewing production statistics and planning adjustments for the next week. His office windows overlooked the assembly floor, where the night shift had taken over. The work continued without pause. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 365 days per year. The factory never stopped. He thought about the trucks rolling off the assembly line. Each one would be shipped to a staging area, then loaded onto cargo vessels, then transported across the Atlantic, then distributed to military units in England or North Africa or eventually France. Thousands of miles from where they were built, these trucks would carry supplies that would sustain American forces in combat against German armies. And when those trucks broke down, because all mechanical equipment eventually breaks down, American mechanics would repair them using spare parts that had been shipped in adequate quantities, with tools that had been mass-produced and distributed widely, following procedures that had been standardized and documented. The trucks weren't technically superior to German equivalents. They were just more numerous, more reliable, easier to maintain, and better supported by a logistics system that actually functioned. In total war, that was superiority enough. August 25, 1944. Saint-Lô, France. Colonel Laurent Albert Ayers studied the map spread across the hood of his Jeep. The tactical situation was simultaneously triumphant and desperate. American forces had broken out from the Normandy beachhead and were racing eastward across France. General Patton's Third Army was covering 50 miles per day in some sectors. The German army was in full retreat, but supply lines were stretched catastrophically thin. The pre-invasion bombing campaign had destroyed French railroads to prevent Germany from moving reinforcements. That strategy had worked perfectly. German forces couldn't use French rail infrastructure to respond to the Allied invasion. Unfortunately, neither could the Allies. Every ton of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment had to be transported by truck from the Normandy beaches to forward units that were now hundreds of miles inland. Ayers commanded motor transport operations for the Motor Transport Brigade. His responsibility was keeping Patton's army supplied. The distances involved made that responsibility nearly impossible. "We need 20,000 tons daily to sustain current operations," his logistics officer reported. "We're delivering maybe 6,000 on a good day. The distance from Cherbourg to forward depots is now over 200 miles. Round-trip time for trucks is running 3 days. We don't have enough vehicles to maintain the required flow." Ayers studied the map. The French road network consisted mostly of narrow 2-lane routes that twisted through small villages and over ancient bridges. Traffic congestion slowed everything. Civilian refugees clogged the roads. Military police struggled to maintain order at major intersections. "What if we commandeer dedicated routes?" Ayers mused aloud. "One-way traffic only, military vehicles exclusively, no civilians, no non-essential military traffic. Reserve the entire road network for supply convoys." His staff exchanged glances. The proposal was radical, possibly unprecedented. "It would work," the logistics officer said slowly, "if we can actually enforce it, if we can organize enough truck companies, if we can establish maintenance and supply stations along the routes, if we can coordinate the entire operation without it collapsing into chaos." "How many trucks can we assemble?" The logistics officer checked his notes. "Approximately 5,000, maybe 6,000 if we pull vehicles from non-essential duties, mix of 2½-ton GMCs and smaller Dodge trucks. Most are in reasonable mechanical condition. 5,000 trucks, each capable of carrying 5 tons of cargo. If organized efficiently and kept moving continuously, that represented sustainable transport capacity of 25,000 tons daily. Enough to meet requirements, barely." "Do it," Ayers ordered. "I want a detailed plan within 36 hours. Route selection, traffic control points, maintenance stations, fuel depots, regulating stations to coordinate convoy flow, the whole system." The staff officers dispersed. Ayers remained by the jeep, staring at the map. What he was proposing was essentially creating a dedicated highway system overnight, organized from nothing, operating without established procedures or institutional knowledge. It would either be the greatest logistics triumph of the war or a catastrophic failure that left Patton's army stranded without fuel. The operation would be called the Red Ball Express, named after railroad terminology for express freight. Red Ball classification symbols would be painted on cargo, vehicles, road signs, and uniform patches. The system would begin operating on August 25, 1944. 36 hours later, the first convoys rolled out from Saint-Lô. August 27, 1944, somewhere between Saint-Lô and Chartres, Private James. Washington, of the 3,524th Quartermaster Truck Company, gripped the steering wheel of his GMC CCKW and fought to keep his eyes open. He had been driving for 16 hours straight with only brief stops for refueling and bathroom breaks. His partner, Private Robert Mitchell, sat in the passenger seat, supposedly resting so he could take over driving duties. But Mitchell was asleep, head lolled back, mouth open. Washington didn't blame him. They had both been awake for nearly 40 hours. Sleep deprivation had become the normal condition, just another hardship to endure along with dust, heat, and the endless monotony of the road. The truck ahead maintained its position, red taillights visible in the darkness. Washington's truck followed, maintaining the prescribed interval. Behind him, another truck's headlights, actually just the dim cat-eye blackout markers, glowed faintly. The convoy stretched forward and backward into the darkness, an endless chain of vehicles moving through French night. Washington was one of approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers who were African American. The Army's segregated structure meant black soldiers were predominantly assigned to supply units rather than combat roles. Now, those supply units were suddenly critical to sustaining the most rapid advance in military history. The irony wasn't lost on Washington or any of the other black drivers. They served a country that denied them full citizenship rights. Many came from southern states where segregation was enforced by law and violence. They drove through French villages where civilians cheered their liberation from Nazi occupation, while knowing they would return to an America where black people couldn't vote, couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white people, couldn't attend the same schools. But they drove anyway, hour after hour, day after day, because the mission mattered, because soldiers at the front needed supplies, because defeating fascism was important, even if America's own racism remained undefeated. The truck hit a pothole. Washington wrestled with the steering wheel, keeping the vehicle on course. The CCKW handled poorly when loaded to capacity, which it always was. The suspension was stiff, the steering was vague, the brakes required significant pedal pressure. None of this mattered. The truck ran, which was all that counted. Mitchell woke up with a start. "Where are we?" "Somewhere in France," Washington replied. "All I can tell you is we're still heading east." They had been given minimal maps and vague navigation instructions. Follow the red ball signs. Stay in convoy. Maintain speed. Don't stop unless absolutely necessary. The truck ahead would lead them to the destination, probably. The convoy system worked, mostly through chaos organized just enough to function. Trucks departed Saint-Lô whenever they were loaded. They joined whatever convoy was forming. Military police at traffic control points directed the policy, flow, ensuring continuous movement. Maintenance vehicles patrolled the routes, ready to assist disabled trucks. If repairs couldn't be completed quickly, the broken truck was simply shoved off the road so the convoy could continue. "I need coffee," Mitchell announced. "Real coffee, not that awful powdered stuff. You'll get whatever they're serving at the next regulating station, assuming we stop, assuming there's anything available." The regulating stations, established every 50 miles or so along the routes, theoretically provided rest areas where drivers could eat, sleep, refuel, and use bathroom facilities. In practice, they were usually overcrowded chaos, where exhausted drivers waited in long lines for minimal services. Washington had been promised regular relief. Two-man crews were supposed to trade off driving duties every few hours. In reality, both men often drove double shifts because there were never enough drivers. Some men resorted to sabotaging their trucks, loosening drain plugs, disconnecting spark plug wires, damaging tires just to get a few hours of sleep while repairs were made. Washington hadn't resorted to sabotage yet, but he understood the impulse. The truck's engine note changed slightly, dropping in pitch. Washington checked the gauges. Engine temperature normal. Oil pressure is good. Fuel level at half. Everything operating within acceptable parameters. The CCKW was a remarkably forgiving vehicle. It tolerated abuse that would have destroyed more sophisticated trucks. The simple design meant there were fewer things to break. "How much cargo do you figure we're carrying?" Mitchell asked. "Full load. 5 tons, maybe more. Artillery shells, I think, based on how heavy the truck feels." "How far we going?" "Chartres, supposedly. Maybe another 100 miles. Mitchell did mental arithmetic. At this speed, we got another 5-6 hours of driving ahead of us. Then we unload, turn around, and drive back to Saint-Lô. 54-hour round trip if everything goes smooth. Everything never goes smooth. True enough. The convoy ahead was slowing. Tail lights brightened as drivers applied brakes. Washington downshifted, letting the transmission help slow the heavy truck. The convoy came to a complete stop. They waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. No information filtered back from the front of the convoy about what was causing the delay. "Breakdown, probably," Mitchell guessed. Or maybe the MP at an intersection is directing traffic somewhere else. Washington set the parking brake and killed the engine to conserve fuel. In the sudden silence, he could hear frogs croaking in nearby ditches. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The normal sounds of a peaceful French countryside at night, utterly disconnected from the massive military operation passing through. 20 minutes later, the convoy began moving again. Washington restarted the truck, released the brake, and eased back into position. Whatever had caused the delay remained a mystery. Not that it mattered. The delay was over. The convoy moved forward. That was all Washington needed to know. They reached a traffic control point around 0300 hours. A military policeman waved the convoy through without slowing. Washington caught a glimpse of a sign with a red ball symbol and an arrow pointing east. The road surface improved slightly, an actual paved highway rather than a rough country lane. "You smell that?" Mitchell asked. Washington did. Smoke. Not the smoke from a house fire or agricultural burning. Chemical smoke, acrid and choking. Somewhere ahead, something substantial was burning. The convoy continued. 5 minutes later, they passed a burning truck on the roadside. Fire engulfed the cab and cargo bed. Whatever had been in the cargo ammunition, fuel, supplies, was gone. The truck was a total loss. Several military police stood nearby, directing traffic around the wreck. No one appeared injured. The truck's crew had presumably escaped before the fire spread. The convoy didn't slow. Burning trucks were just another hazard, like potholes or wrong turns. Washington thought about the statistics he had heard. The Red Ball Express was burning through trucks at an extraordinary rate. Worn tires failed. Transmissions burned out from continuous operation. Engines overheated. Brakes wore down to nothing. The trucks were designed for military use, meaning they were built tough. But they weren't designed for 24-hour operation with minimal maintenance over extended periods. It didn't matter. When trucks broke down, they were repaired if possible, or replaced if not. America had plenty of trucks. That was the entire point. The trucks were expendable. The supplies they carried were not. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dawn broke slowly, painting the French countryside in shades of orange and gold. Washington had been driving for over 20 hours now. His eyes burned, his back ached, his hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel. None of that changed the requirement. Drive, maintain position, deliver cargo. Mitchell had taken over driving duties for a brief period around 0400 hours, giving Washington 90 minutes of fitful sleep while slouched in the passenger seat. Now Washington was back behind the wheel, while Mitchell dozed again. The convoy entered the outskirts of Chartres around 0800 hours. The famous cathedral with its twin spires dominated the skyline, visible for miles. American supply depots sprawled across open fields on the city's eastern edge, vast collections of tents, warehouses, and stacked supplies guarded by military police and protected by anti-aircraft positions. The truck ahead turned off the main route, following signs directing supply vehicles to unloading areas. Washington followed, his truck joining a line of perhaps 50 other vehicles waiting to be unloaded. This would take hours. He set the parking brake again and killed the engine. Mitchell woke immediately, conditioned by weeks of driving to be alert whenever the truck stopped. "We made it," Mitchell said unnecessarily. "Now we get to wait while somebody unloads us. Then we drive back and do it all over again." "Welcome to the Red Ball Express," Mitchell replied with a tired grin. "The fastest supply operation in military history, provided you don't mind waiting in lines." They climbed down from the cab, joints stiff, muscles protesting. Other drivers were doing the same, forming small groups to smoke cigarettes and trade stories about the journey. Most were black soldiers from quartermaster truck companies. Some were white drivers from regular transportation units. The Red Ball had pulled drivers from wherever they could be found, regardless of race, because the mission trumped everything. An exhausted-looking supply sergeant approached, clipboard in hand. "What are you carrying?" "Artillery shells. 1.55mm, high explosive," Washington replied. "According to the manifest." The sergeant made a notation. "You'll be waiting about 3 hours for unloading. Crews are backed up. There's coffee and food in that tent," he pointed. "Try to get some rest. Soon as you're empty, you head back to Saint-Lô and load up again." 3 hours. Washington and Mitchell found the mess tent and got coffee, real coffee, miraculously, and something that might have been scrambled eggs. They ate mechanically, too tired to taste the food. Around them, the massive depot hummed with activity. Trucks arrived continuously, were unloaded, and departed. Supplies were sorted, inventoried, and prepared for distribution to forward combat units. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts, everything an army needed to function. And this was just one depot. Similar operations existed at Dreux, La Loupe, and other locations. The entire system was moving 25,000 tons of supplies daily at peak capacity, more cargo than had been transported in all of the American Civil War, more cargo than most nations produced in a year, an industrial achievement so vast that it exceeded even American planners' optimistic projections. Washington finished his coffee and found a quiet spot to rest. He lay down on bare ground, too exhausted to care about comfort, and immediately fell into deep sleep. 2 hours later, someone shook him awake. His truck was unloaded. Time to head back to Saint-Lô. The return journey took 14 hours. The convoy travelled the southern route, designated for westbound traffic. The roads were quieter, with fewer vehicles. Washington drove on autopilot, his mind numb with exhaustion, his body operating on muscle memory and stubborn determination. They reached Saint-Lô around midnight. The loading area was illuminated by portable floodlights, supplies stacked everywhere, waiting to be loaded onto trucks. The entire operation ran 24 hours a day. There was no night shift or day shift, just continuous operation. A harried-looking corporal directed Washington's truck to a loading bay. "You're getting rations and fuel cans. We'll have you loaded in 90 minutes. "We need sleep," Washington protested. "We've been up for over 40 hours. The corporal consulted his clipboard. "There's a rest area in that building. You can get 6 hours. That's the best I can offer." 6 hours, better than nothing. Washington and Mitchell stumbled to the rest area, a converted warehouse where hundreds of cots had been set up. Most were occupied by sleeping drivers. Washington found an empty cot and collapsed onto it. He was asleep within seconds. 6 hours later, exactly 6 hours, because the army ran on schedule, someone was shaking him awake again. Time to drive, time to load up, time to head east again, with another load of supplies for another forward depot, for another group of soldiers who needed those supplies to continue the advance toward Germany. This was how America sustained its armies in the field, not through military genius or tactical brilliance, but through industrial capacity so vast that it could simply overwhelm all opposition through sheer abundance. September 7th, 1944, Chartres Supply Depot. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stolberg had been captured 3 days earlier near Metz. Now he stood under guard at the massive American supply depot, watching the continuous flow of trucks with something approaching religious awe. The Prussian officer came from a military family that had served Germany since the time of Frederick the Great. He understood warfare. He understood logistics. He understood that what he was witnessing represented the death of everything he had believed about German military superiority. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had delivered 89,000 tons of supplies to the triangle of depots at La Loupe, Dreux, and Chartres. Von Stolberg had been given this statistic by his American interrogators, along with an invitation to observe the operation firsthand. They wanted German officers to understand exactly what they were fighting against. The invitation was unnecessary. Von Stolberg already understood. He watched as a GMC truck pulled into a loading bay, was unloaded by a team of 4 men in less than 30 minutes, then drove away to begin the return journey to Normandy. The efficiency was mechanical, inhuman in its precision. Another truck immediately took its place, the process repeated endlessly. "How many trucks do you have?" Von Stolberg asked the American captain assigned as his escort. "At peak, we operated nearly 6,000 vehicles." The captain replied. "That was about 10 days ago, right after the express started. We've had some attrition from breakdowns and accidents, but we're still running close to 5,000 trucks daily. 6,000 trucks dedicated to a single supply route." Von Stolberg thought about the entire Wehrmacht's motor transport capacity, perhaps 90,000 vehicles of all types for the entire German military. And these were just the trucks assigned to one supply operation, supporting one army group in one theatre of war. The captain continued, sensing von Stolberg's thoughts. "This is just the Red Ball. We've got other express routes starting up. White Ball Express from Le Havre and Rouen to Paris, ABC Express Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi when those ports open, plus regular supply convoys running everywhere else. All told, we've probably got 30,000 trucks operating in France right now." 30,000. Von Stolberg did the mathematics automatically. If each truck carried 5 tons and made 1 trip daily, which was conservative given what he was observing that represented 150,000 tons of supplies moved daily, more cargo than the entire Wehrmacht moved in a week. "Where do all the trucks come from?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. The captain smiled. "We built them. GMC, Dodge, International Harvester, Studebaker. American factories produced over 500,000 2½-ton trucks alone during the war, plus smaller vehicles, plus larger trucks. We've got trucks to spare. To spare." The phrase crystallized everything von Stolberg had begun to understand about American industrial capacity. Germany hoarded its trucks, maintaining them carefully because replacements were scarce. America built so many trucks that they could afford to run them into the ground and simply replace them. An American maintenance crew worked on a disabled truck nearby. Von Stolberg watched them diagnose the problem, a failed fuel pump, remove the damaged component, install a replacement from their supply truck, and have the vehicle running again in under an hour. The mechanics worked without stress or urgency, just routine competence performing a task they had done hundreds of times before. "Your maintenance system is very efficient," von Stolberg observed. "It has to be," the captain replied. "We're running these trucks 24 hours a day. They break down constantly. But we've got mechanics, spare parts, recovery vehicles, the whole support infrastructure. A truck might be down for a few hours, but it's back on the road the same day." German trucks that broke down often sat for weeks waiting for parts. Sometimes they were simply cannibalized to keep other vehicles running. The German maintenance system had collapsed under the strain of extended operations with inadequate replacement parts. Von Stolberg thought about the horses. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with over 500,000 horses. Throughout the war, the numerical strength of German army horses averaged around 1,100,000. Of the 322 German Army and SS divisions in November 1943, only 52 were armoured or motorised. The great bulk of German combat strength, the old-type infantry divisions, marched into battle on foot, with weapons and supply trains propelled almost entirely by 4-legged horsepower. He had seen the joke in American eyes when German prisoners asked where the American horses were. The Americans didn't use horses for logistics. They didn't need to. They had built enough trucks to motorize everything. The strategic implications were crushing. Horses moved at perhaps 15 miles per day under good conditions, less in mud or rough terrain. Most German soldiers marched on foot, with supplies drawn by horses. German infantry divisions couldn't keep up with their own Panzer spearheads, couldn't respond quickly to breakthroughs, couldn't retreat fast enough when threatened with encirclement. American infantry rode in trucks. They could move 50 miles in a day, redeploy rapidly, respond to threats with a speed that German commanders couldn't match. The mobility differential was decisive. A convoy of empty trucks rolled past, heading back toward Normandy. Each truck would reach the coast, be loaded with more supplies, and return to the forward depots. The cycle repeated continuously, day and night, without pause. The system was brutal in its simplicity and utterly effective in its execution. "How do you keep the drivers awake?" von Stolberg asked. 54-hour round trips, continuous driving, minimal rest. It seems impossible to sustain. The captain's expression sobered. It is impossible, or almost impossible. The drivers are exhausted. We're having accidents from fatigue. Trucks run off roads. Some drivers literally fall asleep at the wheel. We've had some fatalities. He paused, then continued. But the supplies have to get through. Patton's army is advancing faster than anyone planned. If we don't keep them supplied, the advance stops. So the drivers keep driving, even when they're dead on their feet. Von Stolberg noticed what the captain didn't mention initially, but was clearly visible. 3/4 of all Red Ball soldiers were African American. The drivers he saw were predominantly black men, serving an army that was racially segregated, fighting for a country that denied them full citizenship. The irony was bitter. Germany had waged war claiming racial superiority. Now German forces were being defeated by an army whose logistics depended on men Germany's ideology insisted were inferior. The evidence before von Stolberg's eyes proved Nazi racial theory was not just morally wrong, it was strategically stupid. By excluding women from the workforce, by persecuting and expelling Jewish scientists and engineers, by organizing society according to ideological fantasy rather than practical reality, Germany had crippled its own war effort. America had mobilized everyone, men, women, black, white, immigrants, everyone, and the result was overwhelming superiority. "Your drivers are very brave," von Stolberg said quietly. "They face danger, exhaustion, and I suspect little recognition for what they accomplish." The captain nodded. "Most people back home don't even know the Red Ball Express exists. But without these men, we don't win this war. The combat troops get the glory. The supply troops get the job done." A staff sergeant approached, saluted the captain, and handed over a clipboard with supply statistics. The captain reviewed them, made a notation, and handed the clipboard back. The sergeant departed without comment. The entire exchange took perhaps 30 seconds, another small example of systematic efficiency that characterized everything American. "We delivered 12,300 tons yesterday," the captain said, reading from his own notes. "That's our single-day record since the operation started. Today, we're on track for about 11,000. Tomorrow, probably similar. Day after day, week after week, until the job's done. 12,000 tons in a single day." Von Stolberg thought about what that cargo meant. Fuel for tanks and trucks, ammunition for artillery and small arms, food for soldiers, medical supplies for field hospitals, replacement parts for equipment, everything an army needed to function. German supply convoys delivering 50 tons to a division were considered successful. The Americans were delivering 250 times that amount daily, just on this one route. "Where does all the cargo come from?" von Stolberg asked. "Not just the trucks, but the supplies they carry, the fuel, the ammunition, the equipment." "American factories," the captain replied simply. "We're producing more war material than we can actually use. Our biggest problem isn't shortage, it's distribution. Getting supplies from factories to ports to ships to beaches to depots to forward units. That's what the Red Ball solves. More than they could use." Germany rationed everything because production couldn't meet demand. America's problem was distributing excess production. The contrast defined why Germany was losing. They walked toward the fuel depot, where thousands of 5-gallon jerry cans were stacked in enormous pyramids. Each can held enough gasoline to fill a truck's fuel tank once. The volume of fuel stored here represented more than some German Panzer divisions received in a month. "How much fuel do you deliver daily?" von Stolberg asked. "Roughly 40% of our cargo is petroleum products," the captain estimated. "So about 5,000 tons daily, just on the Red Bull. Call it 1 million gallons per day, plus additional fuel moving on regular supply routes. 1 million gallons daily. Germany's entire petroleum production, even including synthetic fuel from coal, was perhaps 20,000 barrels daily, about 800,000 gallons. The Red Bull Express alone was delivering more fuel than Germany's entire industrial economy produced. The fundamental problem was visible in stark clarity. Germany lacked oil. The Ploiești fields in Romania provided some, but not enough. Synthetic production helped, but remained inadequate. Germany's entire war machine was fuel-starved, constantly operating on the edge of paralysis. America produced oil domestically in vast quantities, supplemented by imports from Venezuela and Middle Eastern fields. American factories consumed oil liberally. American vehicles burned fuel without conservation. The entire American economy was lubricated by abundant petroleum. Von Stolberg remembered the fuel rationing in Germany. Civilian vehicles had been forbidden since 1939. Military vehicles received barely adequate fuel allocations. Tanks sometimes sat immobile because no fuel was available. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of aviation gasoline. Here, fuel flowed like water. Trucks idled unnecessarily. Generators ran constantly. Nobody seemed concerned about conservation because supply exceeded demand. "Your petroleum production is impressive," von Stolberg said carefully, not wanting to reveal how devastating this observation was. "We're the world's largest oil producer," the captain replied with unconscious pride. "Texas, California, Oklahoma, Louisiana. We've got oil fields everywhere. Plus, we control access to Venezuelan oil and Middle Eastern fields. Germany's entire oil strategy was always doomed because you never had secure access to petroleum sources. The assessment was brutal and accurate. Germany's war plans had depended on capturing Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. When that offensive failed at Stalingrad, Germany's petroleum situation became terminal. Every subsequent operation was fuel-constrained, limiting mobility, restricting air support, hampering logistics. They passed a communications tent where radio operators coordinated convoy movements. Maps covered the walls, showing routes, regulating stations, maintenance facilities, fuel depots. The entire operation was plotted with military precision, every element tracked and coordinated. "How do you organize all this?" von Stolberg asked. "The coordination alone seems overwhelmingly complex." "Radios," the captain explained. "Every major station has radio communication. We track convoy positions, coordinate with traffic control, direct trucks to wherever supplies are needed most urgently. If Patton's Third Army needs ammunition, we load ammunition. If First Army needs fuel, we load fuel. The system is flexible." German logistics suffered from inadequate communications. Orders arrived by courier, often hours or days late. Supply convoys got lost or went to wrong destinations. The entire system operated with friction and delay that undermined efficiency. American communications were swift, reliable, and ubiquitous. Problems were identified and corrected quickly. The entire organization functioned with systematic effectiveness that German logistics officers could only envy. A military policeman approached and spoke briefly with the captain. Von Stolberg couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the captain nod and check his watch. "We need to head back," the captain told von Stolberg. "But I wanted you to see this operation. I want you to understand what Germany is fighting against." I understand, von Stolberg said quietly. I understood several days ago, but this confirms it completely. Germany has already lost this war. We lost it before it started, but we were too blind to see the truth. The captain looked at him with something approaching sympathy. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know this must be difficult. Von Stolberg shook his head. Don't apologize for winning. Your country organized itself effectively. Mine organized itself stupidly. The results were inevitable. They walked back toward the POW holding area. Von Stolberg looked back once at the supply depot, at the endless flow of trucks, at the mountains of supplies, at the systematic efficiency that characterized everything American. He thought about Germany. Bombed cities, starving civilians, exhausted soldiers, an economy collapsing under the strain of total war, all the sacrifices, all the suffering, all the death for nothing. Because Germany had challenged an industrial power so vastly superior that resistance was futile, the Red Ball Express would operate for 83 days, until November 16, 1944, when port facilities at Antwerp, Belgium, were opened and enough French rail lines were repaired. By that time, more than 6,000 trucks had transported 412,193 tons of supplies to advancing American armies from Normandy to the German border. But the impact extended far beyond statistics. The Red Ball proved that American industry could sustain military operations at a scale Germany couldn't match. It demonstrated that American organizational ability could solve impossible logistics problems. It showed that American determination could overcome any obstacle through systematic application of overwhelming resources. Most importantly, it revealed to German soldiers and officers who witnessed it that defeat was inevitable. The psychological impact of confronting American industrial capacity broke German morale more effectively than any battlefield victory could have accomplished. October 15, 1944, prisoner of war camp, England. Von Stolberg sat in the camp library, writing a letter to his wife that would be heavily censored before being sent to Germany. He couldn't describe the Red Ball Express in detail. Censors would remove military information. But he could hint at what he had learned. The Americans possess advantages we never imagined, he wrote carefully. Their industrial capacity exceeds our most pessimistic estimates. They have organized their society for efficiency in ways we never attempted. The results are visible everywhere. He paused, considering how to express the fundamental insight without triggering censorship. We were told that American society was weak, corrupted by capitalism and racial mixing. Everything I see proves those claims were lies. American society is strong precisely because it mobilizes everyone, because it rewards efficiency rather than ideology, because it organizes itself practically, rather than according to fantasy. The letter would probably be censored anyway, but von Stolberg felt compelled to write the truth. His wife deserved to know why Germany was losing. His children deserved to understand that their father's service, however well-intentioned, had supported a regime based on lies. Other German officers in the library were reading American newspapers and magazines, trying to understand the enemy that had defeated them. Life magazine lay open on a nearby table, showing photographs of American factories producing tanks, aircraft, and trucks. The images were propaganda, certainly, but the statistics accompanying them were verifiable and devastating. American aircraft production for 1944 was projected at 96,000 aircraft of all types. Germany might produce 25,000, if fortunate. American tank production exceeded 30,000 annually. German production struggled to reach 12,000. American truck production exceeded 2 million vehicles. German production was perhaps 90,000. Every category showed similar disparities. More steel, more aluminum, more oil, more electric power, more of everything. America wasn't just winning through superior tactics or strategy. America was winning through superior resources applied with superior efficiency. Von Stolberg looked around the library at his fellow prisoners. Most were ordinary soldiers who had followed orders without questioning. the regime's fundamental assumptions. Some were true believers who still insisted Germany would win through superior will or secret weapons. A few, like von Stolberg himself, had begun to understand that everything they had been told was a carefully constructed lie. Germany had started a war it couldn't win. The industrial mathematics made that clear. The only variable had been how long the war would last and how much destruction would occur before Germany accepted defeat. Oberst Heinrich Fischer entered the library and sat down heavily across from von Stolberg. Fischer commanded an artillery regiment before his capture during the Normandy fighting. He looked exhausted, aged beyond his 40 years. "I've been talking with the American officers," Fischer said quietly. "They're surprisingly willing to discuss military matters now that the war's outcome is clear. Do you know what they told me about their artillery ammunition production?" Von Stolberg shook his head. "They're producing more artillery shells in a single day than Germany produces in a week. They fire more ammunition in one preparatory barrage than we expend in an entire month of operations. When American artillery opens fire, they don't conserve ammunition. They simply crush whatever they're shooting at with overwhelming volume." Fischer paused, then continued. "I commanded artillery for 3 years. We rationed every shell. Fire missions were carefully calculated to minimize ammunition expenditure. We achieved excellent results with minimal waste. But it didn't matter. The Americans just buried us under avalanches of steel because they could afford to fire 10 shells for every one we fired." "Industrial capacity," von Stolberg said. "Everything comes back to that. They built more factories, produced more supplies, organized their economy more effectively. We can't match them." "We never could," Fischer replied bitterly. "From the beginning this war was unwinnable, but nobody wanted to hear that truth." The conversation died into silence. What more was there to say? Germany had gambled everything on a war it couldn't win, and now the bill was coming due. Cities bombed into ruins. Industries destroyed. Soldiers dead or captured. Civilians starving. All of it predictable, all of it avoidable. All of it the direct result of ideological blindness that prevented German leadership from seeing reality. Von Stolberg returned his attention to the letter he was writing. "The war will end soon," he wrote. "Germany cannot sustain resistance much longer. When it ends, we must learn from our mistakes. We must build a different Germany, one based on reality rather than ideology, one that values effectiveness rather than racial fantasy, one that can live peacefully with its neighbours." The letter was seditious by Nazi standards. Von Stolberg didn't care. The Nazi regime had led Germany to catastrophe. Speaking truth about that catastrophe was the least he could do for his country's future. November 16th, 1944. Final day of Red Ball Express operations. Private James Washington drove his GMC truck westward along the southern return route, heading back toward Normandy for what might be the last time. The Red Ball Express was officially terminating today. Port facilities at Antwerp, Belgium, were now open. French rail lines were repaired, and portable gasoline pipelines had been deployed. The Express had accomplished its mission. The American advance had been sustained during the critical months, when no other supply system could function. Now, more efficient methods would replace the truck convoys. Washington felt strange about the operation ending. The last 3 months had been brutal, endless driving, constant fatigue, minimal recognition. But he had also felt useful in a way he never had before. The Red Ball mattered. Everyone knew it mattered. Without the supply convoys, the war would have stalled. His partner, Robert Mitchell, dozed in the passenger seat. They had been driving together since August, covering thousands of miles, delivering hundreds of tons of cargo. Mitchell had saved Washington's life once when Washington fell asleep at the wheel, and Mitchell grabbed the steering wheel just before they crashed. Washington had returned the favor 2 weeks later, when Mitchell's attention lapsed during a night drive. They had become brothers through shared hardship, bound by mutual dependence and common purpose. Race mattered less when you depended on someone to keep you alive. The truck's engine ran smoothly, testament to the GMC's robust design. This particular vehicle had covered over 10,000 miles since August without major breakdowns. The transmission was getting worn, the brakes needed adjustment, and the suspension creaked ominously over rough roads, but the truck still ran. Washington thought about the German prisoners he had seen at various supply points. They always looked stunned, overwhelmed by the scale of American logistics. One German officer had asked him, through an interpreter, how many trucks America had built. Washington had laughed and replied that he had no idea, but there seemed to be an endless supply of them. The German officer had just nodded sadly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. Washington understood, intellectually, that the Red Ball Express represented something larger than just trucks moving supplies. It represented American industrial power, American organizational ability, American determination. It represented everything that would ultimately defeat Germany. But on a personal level, it represented 3 months of his life spent doing dirty, dangerous, exhausting work that nobody would remember. He would go back to his regular unit, probably end up in some other supply role, and eventually go home to an America that still didn't treat black people as full citizens. The war wouldn't change that. He knew it wouldn't. He would return to a country that was grateful for his service but unwilling to extend full equality. That hurt. That hurt worse than the fatigue or the danger or the lack of recognition. But he had still delivered the supplies, still done his job, because the mission mattered, even if America didn't fully appreciate the men who accomplished it. Mitchell woke as they approached a regulating station. Last run? Last run. Washington confirmed. After we get back to Normandy and drop off the truck, the Red Ball's over. Good, Mitchell said emphatically. I've had enough of this road to last a lifetime. If I never see another French village or another supply depot, it'll be too soon. Washington smiled despite his exhaustion. You'll miss it. When we're back doing regular supply work, you'll remember when we were part of something that mattered. Maybe, Mitchell admitted. But right now, all I want is 12 hours of sleep in a real bed. They pulled into the regulating station and refueled. The MPs manning the station looked tired, their faces showing the same exhaustion that characterized everyone involved in the operation. 3 months of 24-hour operations had worn everyone down. Heard the express is ending today, the MP said as he recorded their truck number and destination. That's what we heard, Washington replied. Port at Antwerp's open. Railroads are fixed. They don't need us anymore. They needed you when it counted, the MP said. You guys saved Patton's advance, probably shortened the war by months. That's worth something. Washington nodded his thanks and drove on. The MP's recognition meant more than official commendations would have. Someone understood what they had accomplished. The return journey took another 8 hours. Washington and Mitchell traded driving duties, neither willing to risk accidents from exhaustion during this final run. They passed the burned-out wrecks of trucks that hadn't made it, breakdowns, accidents, a few destroyed by German artillery or air attack. Each wreck represented someone's story, someone's sacrifice. They reached the Normandy depot as evening settled over the French countryside. The familiar Red Ball signs were already coming down. The dedicated Red Ball highway would revert to regular military traffic. The system that had sustained the American advance would be dismantled, replaced by more permanent logistics infrastructure. Washington parked his truck in the motor pool, filled out the final paperwork, and grabbed his gear. Mitchell did the same. They walked together toward their unit's bivouac area, too tired to feel much emotion about the ending. You think anyone will remember this? Mitchell asked. 10 years from now, 20 years, will anyone know what the Red Ball Express did? Washington considered the question. Probably not. We're just supply troops. We didn't fight in the famous battles. We didn't capture important objectives. We just drove trucks and delivered cargo. Nobody makes movies about that. Shame, Mitchell said. We did something important. We did, Washington agreed. We know that. The guys who received the supplies know that. That's enough. It wasn't really enough, but it had to be. Black soldiers in a segregated army couldn't expect full recognition. They did their jobs, served their country, and hoped that someday America would live up to its stated ideals. December 28, 1976, Pontiac, Michigan. Robert Harrison, aged 78, stood in the Pontiac assembly plant where GMC trucks were once again being built. The military contracts had ended decades ago. Now the plant produced civilian trucks, pickup trucks, delivery vans, commercial vehicles. The assembly lines still operated with the same fundamental efficiency that had produced the CCKW during the war. Workers performed specialized tasks in coordinated sequences. Components moved along conveyor systems. Quality control inspectors checked work at multiple stages. The entire system functioned with mechanical precision. But the scale was smaller now. The urgency diminished. These trucks wouldn't change history. They would just haul cargo for American businesses, serve farmers and construction companies, be sold and used and eventually discarded. Harrison had been invited back to the plant for a reunion of wartime production managers. About 30 men attended, all elderly now, all remembering the desperate urgency of wartime production when every truck built might mean the difference between victory and defeat. They toured the facility, observing how little had actually changed. The assembly line techniques were the same. The organizational methods were identical. American industry had simply redirected its capacity from military to civilian production, proving that the wartime miracle hadn't been temporary or extraordinary. It had been normal American industrial capacity, operating at normal efficiency levels. Over lunch in the plant cafeteria, Harrison listened to his fellow managers share stories about the war years. Everyone remembered the intensity, the pressure, the sense that their work mattered in ways it had never mattered before or since. We built over 560,000 CCKW trucks during the war, Harrison told the group. GMC alone produced about 250,000. When I visit auto shows now and see vintage military trucks, it's strange to think we built those in this facility, that they crossed the Atlantic and carried supplies that won the war. Do people understand what we accomplished? Asked another manager, Thomas Sterling, who had supervised engine production. When they see those trucks in museums or at military vehicle shows, do they understand what that production achievement meant? Harrison shook his head. I don't think so. People see the trucks and think they're just vehicles. They don't see the organizational structure that built them, the supply chains that delivered components, the workforce that assembled them, the entire industrial system that made mass production possible. Maybe that's appropriate, Sterling suggested. The trucks themselves weren't special. The system that built them was special. And that system is still here, still functioning, still producing. Maybe that's the real legacy. Harrison considered that perspective. The CCKW trucks had been good, reliable vehicles, but nothing technically remarkable. What made them significant was that America could build them in overwhelming quantities, while simultaneously producing everything else needed for total war. The trucks symbolized American industrial capacity, but they weren't the source of that capacity. They were the visible expression of deeper advantages, abundant resources, efficient organization, technological skill, trained workforce, effective institutions. Those advantages hadn't disappeared when the war ended. They remained, built into, the fundamental structure of American society. The factories were still here. The workers were still skilled. The organizational methods were still effective. The industrial system was still capable of extraordinary achievements when necessity demanded. I think our real accomplishment, Harrison said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke, wasn't just building trucks. It was proving that democratic, capitalist societies could organize themselves for total war without abandoning their fundamental values. We didn't need slave labor or totalitarian control. We just needed to organize effectively and let American workers do what they do best. The group fell silent, considering that assessment. Most had lived through both world wars. They had seen the Depression. They had witnessed America's emergence as a global superpower. They understood that the industrial achievements of World War II hadn't been accidents or temporary spikes. They were expressions of deep structural advantages that America possessed over its adversaries. Germany laughed at our trucks, Sterling said quietly. Their propaganda mocked American equipment as crude and unsophisticated. Then, 6,000 of those crude, unsophisticated trucks rolled 24 hours straight and sustained an advance that crushed Germany's last hope of stopping the Allied invasion. They laughed because they didn't understand, Harrison replied. They looked at individual vehicles and saw technical limitations. They never understood that in total war, quantity and reliability matter more than sophisticated engineering. 1,000 adequate trucks defeat 100 perfect trucks. That's the lesson they learned too late. The reunion eventually ended. Harrison drove home through streets that bore no resemblance to the wartime blackouts he remembered. Lights blazed everywhere. Traffic flowed freely. Prosperity was visible in the cars people drove, the houses they lived in, the casual abundance that characterized post-war American life. He thought about the German prisoners who had toured American factories during the war. They must have understood, looking at American industrial capacity, that Germany never had a chance. The mathematical certainty of defeat must have been crushing. Harrison felt no satisfaction in that thought. He respected German engineering and technical skill. In another context, without the ideological madness of Nazism, Germany and America might have been partners rather than enemies. But Germany had chosen war. Germany had organized its society according to racial fantasy rather than practical reality. Germany had challenged an industrial power so vastly superior that defeat was inevitable from the moment war began. The trucks had been part of that defeat, not glamorous weapons like tanks or aircraft, just simple, reliable vehicles that kept supplies moving when armies needed them most. 560,000 GMC CCKW trucks, plus hundreds of thousands of other vehicles from other manufacturers. An industrial achievement so vast that it exceeded even German comprehension. They had laughed at American trucks. Then those trucks had rolled across France, carrying the supplies that sustained the armies that liberated Europe. The laughter had stopped when German officers stood beside French roads, watching endless convoys, understanding finally what American industrial capacity really meant. Harrison arrived home as darkness fell. His wife had dinner waiting. They ate quietly, comfortable in the long silence of a marriage that had endured over 40 years. After dinner, he showed her a photograph from the reunion, 30 old men standing in front of a modern assembly line, commemorating something most Americans had forgotten. "We built something important," he told her. "Not just trucks, but proof that our system works, that free people, organizing themselves voluntarily, can accomplish things totalitarian regimes never could. The trucks were just vehicles, but what they represented that mattered. That still matters." She squeezed his hand. She understood, even if she didn't share his memories of wartime urgency and industrial mobilization. She had lived through those years as a factory worker herself, doing her part, contributing to victory through steady work rather than heroic action. That was the real story of American industrial power. Not individual genius or dramatic breakthroughs, but millions of ordinary people doing their jobs effectively, coordinated by efficient systems, supported by abundant resources, organized through institutions that actually functioned. Germany had possessed individual brilliance, technical excellence, tactical superiority, but Germany lacked the systematic effectiveness that characterized American industry. When the two systems competed, systematic effectiveness won. The trucks had proved that. 6,000 GMC trucks rolling 24 hours straight, delivering supplies that sustained the advance, crushing Germany's last hope. Not through superior design or technical excellence, but through reliable operation, adequate performance, and overwhelming numbers. They had laughed at American trucks. They had stopped laughing when those trucks kept rolling, kept delivering, kept functioning long after sophisticated German vehicles had broken down and been abandoned beside roads they could no longer travel. That was the lesson. That was what future generations needed to understand. Industrial power came not from building the best individual weapons, but from building adequate weapons in quantities that overwhelmed opposition. Quality mattered, but quantity had a quality all its own. The Red Ball Express had proved it. 6,000 trucks, operated by exhausted drivers, poorly maintained, pushed beyond their design limits. But they had kept rolling, kept delivering, kept sustaining the advance that liberated Europe. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.